I'm Sharon Bessell from the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Thank you for the opportunity to present today, albeit from quite a distance, on the research that has led to the development of the individual deprivation measure. I'm going to talk a little bit about our concerns about existing measures of poverty and why we considered a new multidimensional gender-sensitive measure of poverty to be essential. I'm also going to talk about the design of the research on which the individual deprivation measure is based, and to focus particularly on the participatory research in which the measure is grounded. It's this dimension of the development of the IDM that's particularly unique. The research on which the individual deprivation measure is based was carried out at the Australian National University in partnership with a number of organisations and with an international team of researchers. The research on which the individual deprivation measure is based was carried out by local research teams across 18 sites in 6 countries. Our motivation for this research was our concern that mainstream measures of poverty do not respond adequately to gender. Most measures of poverty are not concerned with the differences between women and men. They don't take account of the ways in which gender roles and responsibilities shape the experiences of poverty. The research question that shaped the development of the individual deprivation measure is what is a just and justifiable measure of poverty that is genuinely sensitive to gender and capable of revealing gender disparities. There is, of course, a prior question as to why we need a new measure of poverty. There are in existence a number of measures of poverty, ranging from income-based or money metric measures, usually based around one dimension of income or perhaps consumption, right through to multidimensional measures of poverty. One of the criticisms that we had of many existing measures is that they are binary in their approach. They adopt a cut-off point, below which people are classified as poor, above which people are classified as not poor. Our concern was that these binary measures, regardless of what the cut-off point is, are inadequate. They don't provide the detail or the nuance that's required to both understand poverty and to respond. So, for example, we may have 2 people, A and B, who are both below the poverty line. But are A and B equally poor? Will each of these individuals need the same thing in order to be not poor? What dimensions of poverty are most acute for each? We may have 2 individuals, C and D, who are both above the poverty line, but are they in the same situation? Is one more vulnerable? Is one experiencing poverty in particular dimensions? And very importantly, from a gender perspective, we may have 2 people, one female, one male, at the same level of poverty. But do these 2 individuals experience poverty in the same way? Do they experience the same dimensions of poverty? Do they need the same things in order to move out of poverty? This is the kind of nuance we need to know from a measure of poverty in order to respond. Another concern about existing measures of poverty, and one that's particularly acute from a gender perspective, is that most existing measures of poverty take the household as the unit of analysis. In order to measure poverty in a way that is sensitive to gender, we need to look inside the household in order to be able to assess the intra-household distribution of resources and access to services. We need to take the individual, not the household, as the unit of analysis. So, our primary concern in approaching this research, one of the motivations for us in developing a new multidimensional gender-sensitive measure of poverty, was our concern that current measures simply don't tell us enough. They don't tell us what we need to know to ensure that no one is left behind. They don't tell us enough about gender differences. They don't tell us about intersectorality, the way in which not only gender, but ethnicity, religion, geographic location, ability or disability intersect with poverty to shape, to constrain, and in some cases to destroy people's lives. Taking all of this into account, we set about developing a multidimensional gender-sensitive measure of poverty that addressed some of the shortcomings that we had identified in existing measures. Our research design is based on 3 phases. The first phase involved participatory research with just over 1,100 people. The second phase was a quantitative phase where we returned to survey people on their preferences in terms of the dimensions that should appear within the measure of poverty. And the third phase involved trialling the new measure, the individual deprivation measure, in the Philippines. The research on which the individual deprivation measure is based took place in 6 countries. In the Pacific, Fiji; in Southeast Asia, Indonesia and the Philippines; and Angola, Malawi and Mozambique in Southern Africa. A primary consideration in choosing which countries we would work in was the existing networks and the existing services provided by our partner institutions. A couple of issues were important here. Firstly, because our partners were already working within these countries, we were able to access deep local knowledge, the kinds of contextual knowledge that's crucial for participatory research. We also were confident that we would be able to develop, to build, to work with local research teams who were essential to conducting the participatory research and did an amazing job in gathering the kinds of nuanced, detailed data that we needed. We were also aware that regardless of the outcomes of the research, regardless of what the measure ultimately looked like, the research would be valuable to our partners in terms of shaping the kinds of services they provide, the kind of interventions that they develop. So we felt that by undertaking the research in these countries, regardless of the ultimate research outcomes, the findings would be practically valuable to our partners. And this mattered. We wanted this research to have positive, practical outcomes. Of course, there are some gaps in terms of countries. We don't have representation from Southern Asia, we don't have representation from China or from Latin and South America. But an important point to make here is that the dimensions that are included in the individual deprivation measure that were developed from our participatory research are based on findings that are very similar across each of the countries. And so the dimensions are representative of experiences of poverty across very, very different contexts. A second important point to keep in mind here is that in each country we worked in 3 different sites, so a total of 18 research sites. In each country we worked in 1 urban site, 1 rural site and 1 highly marginalised site. And here the concern wasn't the geographic location of the community, but the extent to which exclusion, stigma and marginalisation was experienced by that particular community. A unique feature of the individual deprivation measure that is not shared by mainstream measures of poverty is that it is grounded in participatory research. Our position here was that for a measure of poverty to be just and justifiable, it must reflect and be grounded in the lived experiences and the priorities of those who have experienced poverty. Our starting point here was the view that people are experts in their own lives, that people have knowledge and expertise that must be taken into account when poverty is conceptualised, defined and importantly measured. This is not to dismiss or ignore the value and importance of expert knowledge, but to emphasise the role of participatory research in providing a foundation for the individual deprivation measure. In developing the participatory phase of the research, we distinguished between methodology and method. Our methodology refers to the principles and theoretical perspectives that underpin the research. The methods are the tools that we use to gather data and gain insight. In developing our methodology, we drew on feminist principles and theoretical perspectives of gender and development to ensure that the research recognised, illuminated, and challenged existing power structures. Drawing on principles of human rights-based approaches to research, we ensured that our methodology placed at the centre respect for the people who were participating in the research. Our methodology was designed to ensure that our participants understood what the research was about, were able to make informed decisions about whether or not they wanted to participate, were able to withdraw from the research at any point if they wanted to, and were able to express their views freely in a context that felt safe and comfortable for them. We worked separately with small groups of women and small groups with men, and we also divided participants not only according to sex, but also according to age, to ensure that we were able to capture dimensions of poverty that are sensitive to gender, but also sensitive to generation and the different issues that people may face as they move across the life course. Our methods were shaped by participatory approaches and sought to put into practice our methodology. We used a range of methods from group discussions to poverty ladders, household mapping, brainstorming and ranking. We also used key informant interviews to gain an understanding of the context within which we were conducting the research. 3 important findings that came out of the first phase of our research. Firstly, that poverty is scalar. While participants agreed that there is this distinction between the poor and the non-poor, across all sites, people talked in nuanced ways about the way in which poverty plays out. Even those who are poor may be more or less poor, and in many cases there were different words used to describe different levels of poverty. What our participants told us about the scale and nature of poverty is reflected beautifully in the photograph that's on the screen here. We can see the women at the front of the group have no umbrellas and no shoes. The next group back have umbrellas, some have shoes. At the very back, the women are wearing shoes and are also riding bicycles. This is exactly what people described in terms of the way in which people are able to access and utilise resources and also able to access and utilise services, depending on the nature and the extent of their poverty. And so any measure of poverty needs to be able to capture these realities and nuances. Second, people told us very clearly that income matters. Money is important. Money provides access to resources and to services. But people also told us very clearly that income or money is not enough in order to understand and to measure and to respond to poverty. We need to understand, to define and to measure poverty in ways that are multi-dimensional. This phase of the research revealed that the dimensions of poverty that should be measured must include things such as healthcare, education, water, sanitation, the kinds of things that we see in existing multidimensional measures of poverty. But people also told us very, very clearly that there are additional dimensions of poverty that must be measured. These include dimensions around experience of violence, which participants described in great detail as being deeply connected to poverty. Time use was very important. The nature of work, social relationships and support systems. So our phase 1 research revealed very clearly that poverty has material dimensions, but absolutely profound social dimensions. And a multi-dimensional measure of poverty needs to be able to illuminate not only the material, but also the social dimensions of poverty. Our phase 1 research also revealed that access to goods and services matters. And so when we're thinking about measurement, we need to think about how we might be able to measure access. But participants also told us very clearly the cost, reliability and quality also matters. And so a multi-dimensional measure of poverty that is genuinely able to illuminate the nature and experiences of poverty and how policy and services and intervention should respond needs to take account also of cost, reliability and quality. To provide an example, in one site in Indonesia, women said very clearly that they did have access to contraception, but they also said that they didn't use it. They didn't use it because it was cheap, it was affordable. And so if we only asked about affordability or access, the response would likely be, yes, we are able to access and afford contraception. But women said they didn't use it because it was cheap and they were concerned about the quality and the reliability. Women told us that they knew of people within their community who had used contraception that was cheap and had become sick as a consequence. They also said that they were concerned that the contraception that they were able to afford might be unreliable, and so they preferred not to use it. So this is a level of nuance that is important if we're to genuinely illuminate the nature of poverty, and particularly those dimensions of poverty that are important for women. We may need to ask about more than access alone. From the first phase of our research, we came up with 25 candidate dimensions. In the second phase of the research, we returned to the same sites but with a greater number of participants to cross-check to see whether we'd missed anything and to rank those candidate dimensions. And Scott is going to talk about that process in phase 2 in more detail. At the end of the first 2 phases, we developed the individual deprivation measure, which has 15 dimensions, including the things that we would expect perhaps to see in a measure of poverty around food, water, shelter, health and education. But it also has a number of dimensions that are quite different, that are quite new. Clothing, for example, because people told us in the first phase of our research that the type of clothing that people are able to access, to afford, makes a difference in terms of the way in which they're able to engage in their communities. It makes a difference to the level of stigma that they experience. It makes a difference to the types of jobs that they're able to seek. Relationships, violence, time use, work, voice in the community and the family. All of these things are essential if we're going to measure and seek to understand poverty in a multidimensional way. And Scott's going to talk in more detail about these dimensions and how the individual deprivation measure was built and can be used. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the individual deprivation measure and the way we designed the research that has resulted in the measure. One take-home point that I'd leave you with is the importance of the participatory research in which this measure is grounded. And I'd suggest to you that this is a genuinely unique feature of the individual deprivation measure, and one that's extremely important.